Now, today marks the final day of the World Government Summit in Dubai, a global platform that has brought together heads of state, policymakers and business leaders to focus on shaping future-ready governments. Now, one of the standout conversations this week focused on Africa's position in the global investment landscape and why the continent continues to receive only a small share of global foreign direct investment. That discussion was moderated by our guest this evening, that is John Defterius, former CNN Business Emerging Markets Editor and now Strategic Senior Advisor at APCO Worldwide. John, good evening and welcome to Daily Roundup.
Yeah, thank you very much, Salima, for having me, and greetings from Dubai.
All right. Just to start off, to set the stage for our viewers, what were the central messages you heard from African leaders during your panel on investment? Now, talking particularly around the idea that Africa seeks investment partnership and not aid.
Yeah, that's the narrative shift, I think, Salima, that came out of the World Government Summit 2026 for sure. This is a gathering of 47 leaders at the World Government Summit. And I would say on day two, we had excellent representation from Africa itself. In fact, there was the launch of the Global Africa Investment Summit for 2027, which will take place on the continent. And at that launch, we had the presidents of Angola, we had the president of Tanzania, the president of Ghana, and the prime minister of Mozambique. And they gave presentations the night before we actually had the roundtable. And they laid out the spirit of reforms. There's a recognition that there's a perception problem on the African continent, that it's too risky for global investors to go in. And all four of the leaders suggested, look, we have pushed forward reforms, we're pushing transparency at this stage, and we have a lot to offer on the table. And that was the same message that was carried out in front of at least 2,000 people at this global forum when we had the roundtable, which included the former president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akin Adesina. So it was a breakthrough, because usually there's the geopolitics of what's taking place in Africa, the role of China in the investment, the competition with the United States and Europe. But this narrative was quite different. It's like, how do we go from here to there, and what does Africa have to offer global investors today?
Indeed. Now, John, in your view, why does Africa currently attract just 4% of global foreign direct investment? Now, this is despite representing about 20% of the world's population. Now, what are the core misconceptions or barriers that are holding investment back?
It's a very good question. In fact, the global foreign direct investment in 2026 was $1.5 trillion. And believe it or not, Africa attracted $60 billion. And the trend, when I was emerging markets editor at CNN and anchor and having covered Africa, is that it always garners about 3 to 4% of that global FDI. It's not enough. But what I think, Salima, are the barriers here is the perception of the risk of Africa. The lending by the regional banks and the local banks are 4 to 5 times higher than you would receive, for example, in Europe, where I live, or in the United States, or even Asia for that matter. So what Dr. Adesina had talked about at the summit is that we have to de-risk Africa. The African governments themselves have to continue on the pathway of reforms, which is very important, continue on the pathway for transparency, and then work with, for example, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank of China, which is very active on the African continent, to de-risk the investments that are there. But something that's very different, Salima, we've been talking about the last 20 years of this being the era for Africa. Truly, I think 2025 has marked a huge shift, and I'll tell you why. For example, we see the rollout internationally for artificial intelligence. We saw $2.3 trillion go into low carbon or renewable energy last year. You cannot have the rollout of artificial intelligence and the energy transition without the strategic assets that Africa sits on top of. So I think the prime position for Africa right now is that the natural resources that it has in strategic minerals. For example, the Tanzanian president had signified that they signed 3 major strategic mineral deals in 2025. To give you another example, Tanzania is sitting on a, understand this, $42 billion LNG project for natural gas in Tanzania with three major international producers, ExxonMobil, Shell, Equinor of Norway. If you're going to ask me that question 3 or 4 years ago, will we unlock the potential of strategic minerals and natural gas in one country alone, Tanzania? Mozambique, a $20 billion LNG project with Total. It was struck by some terrorist activity in the north, but they did unlock it. Total Energies is committed to that country and that project. And he has a project there. So what I think what Africa has now are the ingredients to solve the energy shortage around the world because of the rollout for AI, and critically the strategic minerals. I would say the same thing for Namibia right now. I know it's that are being exported already, but there's money on the table to pursue this even further.
Now, presidents in attendance, Samia Suluhu Hassan, Joe Lorenzo, and John Mahama, articulated that risk perception and governance concerns still, dampen investor confidence. Now, from your conversations, how realistic are those concerns, and what steps are governments taking to address them?
Well, they have been pursuing the reforms, and this has been underway for the last 5 years. What investors want to see, Salima, is the consistency of the reforms, and then say the rule of law, the governance, the tax policies that have been put in place by many of these governments on the African continent. If you're going to put a tax policy in place and you brought in foreign direct investment, will those tax policies continue? And then it's the clustering of the different lending institutions. I said about the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and other institutions. But at the same time, you have to get the local banks involved to give the currency protection. I can give you 2 examples of what I'm talking about. Nigeria, the largest populated country on the continent, it's seen strains in its currency over the last 3 years, falls of 30 to 70%. Egypt has suffered the same fate, another large economy in Africa. So if I'm an investor, I put money at stake in your country, and then I want to return or repatriate my profits from a project like that, and I've seen my local earnings in a country fall from 50 to 70%, I need to have those investments hedged. And there's instruments to make sure that it happens, to do those instruments to make sure I protect the international investor. And at the final point is, there's always that perception, the corruption perception. I think Africa has been dealing with it in a very clear way, but it's going to take a little bit of time to deal with that legacy. But the continuity of reforms that I heard here at the World Government Summit, I think was impressive. The other thing I think your viewers should know, in the last 5 years, profound shift as a level of investment that we've seen coming from the UAE. The UAE is now the #1 investor in Africa over the last 3 years. They've got strategic ports in place. I saw that the Global South Utilities company.
John?
There's 70 million people that don't have access to electricity. 500 million of those are in Africa.
All right, John, can you still hear us?
Yes, I can. I know the line's a little bit, I can still hear you.
We seem to be experiencing technical challenges, but just to continue with the next question, one of the reoccurring themes at the summit has been the role of AI, talking of artificial intelligence and future technologies in governance and economic growth. Now, in your view, how can AI and digital infrastructure influence investment flows to Africa, and what should governments do to harness this?
Well, another project we had here at the summit was a discussion we had today was the global bureaucracy perception. At APCO, we polled 13 countries around the world to look at the importance of dealing with government bureaucracy and in investment. So along with the reforms I'm talking about, Salima, is very important. It's also very important to have the digital governance so investors feel very confident about what's on the table for them. Efficiency, the rule of law, the speed of access to the projects that are on the table are all very important.
John, would have loved to hear more from you, but we seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties, but we'll still try to get in touch with you for our next show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Salima. Sorry about the technical difficulties until we got on the air.
Of course. That was John Defterius. He's the former CNN Business Emerging Markets Editor and now a strategic senior advisor at APCO Worldwide, just giving us a brief on the World Government Summit that's taking place in Dubai. We'll be back with more after this break.